So greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us in person, and thank you to all of you joining us virtually on Zoom for our October lunchtime expedition presentation. My name is Corienko. I am the interim curator of the Draper Natural History Museum. Just a couple quick announcements. If you would do this with me, if you would take your mobile cellular device, and if you would just silence that or put it on airplane mode during today's presentation. We want to take a minute to thank our sponsors, Sage Creek Ranch and the Nancy-Carroll Draper Charitable Foundation, that has helped to make all of our public programming possible. We also want to thank all of you for continuing to show your support and attendance for these public programs. These lectures are being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. If you've missed any of our previous presentations dating back all the way to 2018, you can go to youtube.com. Search Draper Natural History Museum, look for the bear icon, and you will see a playlist of all of our videos for lunchtime programs each year, 2018 forward, as well as some other videos that we have produced. If you'd like to be added to our email list, once a month we send out MailChimp notice of upcoming presentations, as well as links to previous talks on that listserv. So just flag me down at the end of the presentation. I'll take down your name and email, and then you'll start receiving those notifications. Also, please feel free to invite friends and family to future talks as well. We're always happy to have more, and the more folks we see, the more that encourages us to host programs like this. Today, we will hear from Rebecca Levine. Levine leads the Meeteetse Moose Project as her graduate work with the University of Wyoming. She is a researcher with the Meeteetse Shop, where she also studies other ungulates and contributes to research on the health of bighorn sheep and mule deer populations across the state. Before arriving in Wyoming, Levine worked seasonally as a backcountry guide and outdoor educator. She earned her undergraduate degree at Swarthmore College with a major in biology and a minors in Spanish and environmental studies. Levine has spent the last 3 years studying moose, seeking to understand how they navigate the competing demands of reproduction, nutrition, and survival. Much like moose, Levine prefers to be in, on, or around water whenever possible. So without further ado, please give Rebecca Levine a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Corey, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm really excited to share what I've been working on for the past 3 years, and especially excited to get to share this with folks who have spent time in the Cody area and who really have a connection to the work that I'm doing and understand this system. There's like such a wealth of knowledge in this room, and excited to hear what you all think about what we're figuring out about our moose. Oh, there we go. So like Corey said, I'm a grad student at the University of Wyoming, and I'm part of a larger research group, which means that I get to be involved in all sorts of work beyond just moose. And our research group, the Meeteetse Shop, focuses on studying ungulates and following individual animals over many, many years to understand their stories and better inform management that can conserve those populations. And we have research going on all over Wyoming with big projects studying bighorn sheep, mule deer, elk, and pronghorn. And if you see this map and anything pops out and piques your interest, please feel free to come up to me after the talk. I'd love to share anything that I can about this work and point you in the right direction if you're curious. But I'm going to focus on moose. My work happens in the Meeteetse area, and I'm building on some really wonderful research that happened in the Snowies before I started with this research group. So the main event, moose. Moose are the largest animal in the cervid family. Cervids are white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, caribou, and then the biggest moose. And they evolved in the far north. They're a circumpolar species, which means that you can find them all across the northern part of North America, but also in Scandinavia, Europe, Russia, and even into China. And there are different subspecies of moose in all of these areas. The subspecies that we have around here is the Shiras moose. So if you see that little finger pointing down towards Wyoming, that's where the Shiras moose live. It's the smallest subspecies of any of the ones that you find in this distribution. And it's also the subspecies that reaches the furthest south, which is going to be a very important element in everything I tell you after this. And that's because over the last decade, there's been growing concern about declines in southern moose populations. So this map shows us some of our southern moose in Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado. And the populations that are shaded in gray are declining. So over half of the populations in this southern area of Moose Range are in decline. But the thing that's really tricky about intervening to stop these declines and help our moose populations is that if we zoom in on any given population, there are different reasons that we identify for why these declines are happening. So in some areas, like the Northeast in Maine, there are huge tick infestations. Now Jackson is seeing those problems. And moose can really suffer from hair loss and blood loss. So calves can die from the amount of blood they lose from ticks, and adults can die from all this rubbing to get the ticks off. They lose their hair, and then they can freeze. But we don't have tick problems everywhere. The moose here in Meeteetse have really low tick loads, which is great to see. But there are other challenges that populations can face. So humans love waterfront property. I think it's beautiful, love hanging out by the lake. But that means that moose in northern Minnesota, where there are tons of lakes, might be avoiding areas where humans like to hang out because of that development. And then we get to growing whitetail populations. Whitetail are expanding from where they used to be more in the east, and they've started moving west and into higher elevations. This introduces competition because they eat similar foods, but also introduces new parasites that moose aren't equipped to handle, things like meningeal worm and arterial worm. And then, of course, predators. Predator populations are rebounding, especially around the Yellowstone area, and though moose evolved to handle predators, they haven't had to deal with them for a while, so these rebounding predator populations are also a factor. So while the factors impacting moose vary, and it's really tricky to untangle exactly what's going on across the range, there are some things that stay pretty consistent, and that is that moose are a cold-adapted species. So on that map, you see that border all in the north. Basically, they only inhabit areas where you wouldn't want to be caught without a jacket. The other side of the coin to this, to being a cold-adapted species, is that it also means they're really heat sensitive. So all the things that make them good at surviving in the far north make them pretty bad at surviving when temperatures get above 50 degrees. So in their summer coat, moose can start to overheat at just 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which means if you spent the summers around here, it kind of seems like a miracle that moose can even be here. And one of the reasons that they're so heat sensitive, beyond just the fact that they have these really large bodies and dark hair, is that they don't have the physiological ability to sweat. So when we get hot or nervous, we start sweating, and that helps us cool down. But moose don't have the pores to release sweat, so they can't cover their body in liquid in order to cool themselves off, which is very different than their close relatives. Elk can cover 90% of their body in sweat, and it makes them much more flexible in terms of what thermal environment they can inhabit. Since moose don't have this luxury, they have to resort to changing their behavior to stay cool. So they can't turn to physiology like sweating, which means that they mostly rely on their behavior. And they do like pretty much exactly what you or I might do on a hot day. They slow their movement, they look for a shady spot, and they bed down during the hottest part of that day. And these behavioral changes help them in a couple of ways. One is that they produce less heat themselves. So if you're running around, you get hot. Same with a moose. If they slow their movement, their body's producing much less heat. It also helps them slow the heat that they gain from the environment. So if they go find shade, that sun's not hitting them, they can reduce the amount of heat that they're taking on. And lastly, the element that I'm really focusing on is they can change their behavior to actually help suck heat away from their bodies. And some wonderful work done before I started with the Monteith shop that happened in the Snowies looked at how moose can do this. So we looked at bed site selection, so where are moose choosing to bed down when it's hot during the day, and found that a huge factor in what moose are looking for is wet soil. And wet soil does just what I was talking about. It takes that heat that they're holding in their body and it helps pull it away and dissipate it into the ground. it can bring that heat away and actively cool them. So instead of just avoiding getting hotter, moose can actually start to get cooler by using this behavior. And it's not just wet soil that they use, but they can actually bed down in standing water, which is even better at cooling them down. This is a video from the point of view of a moose. We can see that it's bedded in water. Much more on these videos to come. This won't be the last time you get to see from the point of view of a moose today. But what does this actually mean for moose? Why do we care about hot moose? We don't hear about moose just tipping over from getting too hot one day in the same way that they might die from having too many ticks or being killed by a predator. So what's going on? Why do we really care about moose getting too hot? It's because time is precious, even for a moose who sometimes seems so lazy and slow when you watch them. Moose have really busy days. They have to spend their time feeding, bedding down. The females spend a lot of time providing care to their calf and traveling between all the sites where they do these things. So let's say we turn up the heat. Like we already talked about, they have limited options. They can't sweat. They have to bed down during the hottest parts of the day to stay cool. And if it gets hotter, that means that they have to bed down for longer, which means that takes time away from things like feeding or providing care. And I know it may not seem like a lot, like 1 extra hour of the day bedded down. What does that really mean? But we have to think about how that accumulates over time. So 1 hour every day of the summer when the food is really nutritious could be the difference between a moose having enough energy to successfully raise a calf versus suffering from malnutrition the following winter. And it's these little changes that the heat induces that really start to accumulate and impact moose. And we see evidence of this when we compare moose across latitudes. So there's a lot going on in this graph, but on the x-axis going horizontally, we go from more southern populations to more northern populations, and this is a graph of pregnancy rates. So you can see the line trending upwards means that pregnancy rates increase the further north we get. So southern populations have lower pregnancy rates than northern populations, and the same trend exists for twinning rates and cow-calf ratios. Basically, as we get to these more northern, cooler areas, moose are doing a better job of reproducing, and the moose in the southern areas that are suffering because of these warm temperatures, that manifests in low reproductive rates. I know you're probably wondering where we are on this map. This specific study wasn't going on when this graph was created, but we're at 44 degrees north. And so from this graph, we would expect to have about 75% pregnancy rates, which we'll come back to and see if that's actually true. So we know that warming temperatures are negatively impacting moose, but there's also a lot that we don't know about the details of how that's happening and how warmer temperatures might be differentially impacting different moose. So what makes a hot moose? Well, it's pretty complicated, but I've tried to distill it down, so bear with me. 2 big things are metabolism and thermal inertia. Metabolism is the fancy word for how much heat a moose is producing, and thermal inertia is the fancy word for how quickly can it get rid of that heat. And things that impact metabolism and thermal inertia are body size and energetic demands. A larger animal can't get rid of heat as quickly and has a higher metabolism, and an animal with more energetic demands also has a higher metabolism. So bigger animals with more energetic demands are hotter animals. We also can't ignore the role of nutritional condition. So the amount of energy that a moose has really influences how much energy it can spend on cooling off. A moose in better condition can spend more of that on staying cool. And lastly, age. It's pretty well established that as animals age, they get a little bit worse at thermoregulating every year. So older animals we would expect to have more trouble when it gets hot. But I want to focus on a few parts of this, first being body size. Of course, there's variation between individual moose in body size. We've all seen like the massive bull and the tiny bull next to each other, but the big difference is actually between males and females. Moose are what's called a size dimorphic species, which means that males are a lot bigger than females. And this means that we have to think about a concept called sexual segregation. And that's because since males and females are such different sizes, they often need different habitat. So really large males, they need to focus all summer on eating lots of fibrous food to grow their antlers, while females, which are much smaller and raising a calf, need sort of nutritious, really new spring growth in order to fuel that lactation. They need different types of food. They also have different predation risks. Males don't have to worry much about predators, but females who have their calf need to be much more vigilant. And all of this leads to males and females using much different areas. And this has been shown both in what they eat and how vigilant they are of predators, but we haven't yet figured out how this relates to what they need to stay cool. What thermal environment do they need, and how does that differ? Since we talked about how this difference in body size probably means that they have different heat sensitivities. The next thing I'm thinking about is energetic demands. And different times of year, moose have different energetic demands. The most energetically intensive time of year for a female is the time right after she gives birth. It's this peak lactation when she needs to be investing a huge amount of energy in raising her calf and keeping that calf safe. Which means that we would probably expect to see different energetic demands between females that have a calf and females that don't, and maybe that exists also in their heat sensitivity. That brings us to my work. All of those questions, all of those what ifs are what I'm trying to answer with the Meeteetse Moose Project. I want to understand how these individual traits like sex, body size, age, may be impacting how moose are or aren't suffering on a really hot day, and how warmer temperatures throughout the summer could be impacting some groups of moose differently than others. So right now we understand that warmer temperatures are having an impact on the population level, but we don't really fully understand the nitty-gritty of the dynamics of that and what sorts of impacts might be happening below the population level. So to give you a little bit of background of what we're doing, first, can I get a show of hands of who's from the Cody area? Okay, who recognizes where we are on this map? So the yellow star is Meeteetse. This is a map of our study area, and in red, I've highlighted our focus areas for where we have GPS collars out on animals. So this is everywhere from Meeteetse Creek to the Gooseberry Creek, and we have 30 collars out, 15 males and 15 females. And the project has been going on since 2020 with plans to wrap up in spring 2023. A part of this study that I got to tease, but I didn't fully tell you about, is all of the female collars that we have out actually have cameras on them that are recording video footage. And I'm super excited to show you a lot of it and just wanted to give you a taste of some of what we get to see and a little quiz of if you recognize what area this moose might be hanging out in. Does anybody recognize those cliffs? Sort of a niche question, but if you're ever driving up to the Jack Creek trailhead and you look to your left, there are some really beautiful cliffs up there, and this moose is hanging out just below them. I also really appreciate this video because it highlights a special eating ability that sets moose apart from other ungulates. So you saw how it put its whole mouth over that branch and stripped all those leaves off. That is something that other ungulates don't really do because they don't have the right mouth structure, and it means that moose can consume food way more efficiently, and that's how they can be so big and just eat salad, because that wouldn't be a very fun life. So we talked about how having a calf might be impacting heat sensitivity in moose, but in order to figure out if that's happening, I first have to see if the moose have calves. And that's how I kick off my summer. Every May is the calving period when moose give birth. and I get to go to their birth sites and see if the calf is alive. This has been some of the most exciting work that I've gotten to do because we've just been totally shocked by the birth sites that moose choose. And I'll show you the most dramatic one that I thought was a GPS error, or I didn't know what I was gonna find when I was out there. So this is F07's birth site. You can see the arrow is pointing to her, and there's a little brown dot, that's her calf. These are the sagebrush hills below Carter Mountain on the 91 ranch. And she spent her winter on Meeteetse Creek in some really beautiful forest. Around May 15th, she started to make a move out of that forest, and she did a big loop. She left Meeteetse Creek, she went over towards Little Rawhide, and then she came back in the middle, plopped down right here in the middle of the sagebrush, and decided to give birth. And we haven't figured out why yet, but it's led to a lot of interesting questions about why moose choose to give birth where they do. So we've seen some patterns. For example, when I go out to the birth sites, I've noticed that they like to have 180 degrees of open. So they want like something solid to their back, whether that's thick forest or a big cliff, and then some clearing with an open view, which maybe that's so they can look out for predators, or that's my best guess, but we're still figuring that out. And you can't see the topography super well, but she's in this little ditch, so she has some cover to her back and then is facing out with a good view. So now I want to go through and show you all some examples of other birth sites that we've seen, just to show you how different they can be and why we're so curious about what these different birth sites might mean for the fate of a calf. So this calf, well, I'll let you guess. Does anyone recognize this area? We're almost up to Kerwin here, up the Wood River, and this calf was born right in the river bottom. So we have video from the time of birth until now. It's been about 6 hours since this calf was born. Between the birth and now, mom was licking all the goo off of the calf, so now she looks all fluffy. Our next birth site, this calf is starting to get up and walk away from the birth site about a day after she was born. This is up Jack Creek, so what you can't see is there's some nice willows to their back, and they're working their way up a sagebrush slope. And our last birth site where you'll see some familiar cliffs. These are the first steps this calf has taken. Not the most coordinated yet. But my monitoring of calf survival doesn't just end with the birth sites. While that's been a really interesting part, it only gets harder throughout the summer. I have to keep checking on them and see how long the calf survives, because especially during the first few months of life, that calf is really vulnerable to dying. So every 2 weeks after a calf is born, I go out, find mom, and see if the calf is with her, which I mentioned the birth sites tend to have a good 180-degree view, which means I can sneak up and not bother them and just try and glass for a long time and look for the calf. But as the calf gets more mobile, the searches get way harder. This is an example of a calf search that actually I didn't have to hike very far for. I took this picture while I was standing on Mary Rumsey's driveway. The water you can see here is the Wood River, and I'm just looking across. If you all know Mary, you know that there's a deer that hangs out in her driveway that is somewhat aggressive towards her. So while I was watching this moose, that deer was barking at me. But we have our moose in view. She's in some thicker willows. Does anybody see a calf with her? Will you help me on this calf search? I see some pointing. All right. Did you guess right? All right, you're all hired. Come work for me. The calf searches can be tricky. One, because of this, it's hard to see the calf. Two, moose don't love when you get super close to them when they have a calf, so it's a balance of getting close enough to see what's going on and staying far enough away to not get stomped on. And this is one of the reasons why we tend to visit these moose over and over again. So if I go 1 week and I don't see a calf, I don't just write like dead calf on my data sheet and then call it good. I visit multiple times after that to make sure that me not seeing the calf actually means that that calf died. And I continue to do this until the end of the summer, when the chance of a moose calf dying drops pretty low, and if moose make it through the summer, their first summer, they tend to survive to adulthood. So this is an example of what a moose calf towards the end of the summer looks like. And see, if you can see past the dewlap, it's up on its own, eating, much more coordinated and able to keep up with mom if they need to run anywhere. So if I take all of this information, all the time hiking around, all the time stressed that a moose is going to chase after me, I get a pretty nice graph that I can walk you through. This is an example of the information that we get from all that time spent. So in 2021, we had 16 female moose that we were studying. 13 of those 16 moose were pregnant in March. We catch them and we ultrasound them to see if they are pregnant. So of those 13 moose, 10 of them gave birth to a live calf, and across the summer, 7 of those 10 survived the summer, presumably following their mom around until she was ready to give birth the next year. Now, a call back to see if you were listening. What pregnancy rate did we expect at 44 degrees north? Nice. And our pregnancy rate that we observed in 2021 was 80%, so close and right around what we might expect for moose at this latitude. With this information about calf survival, I can break up the animals I study into 3 big groups. So we talked about the males versus the females, but with the calf survival information, we can have males, reproductive females, and non-reproductive females. And I can use that to compare what bed sites they use depending on this status. So here's an example of a bed site I visit throughout the summer. There's my backpack and my data sheet, and that little yellow Martian-looking thing is a mini temperature logger to get a sense of the microclimate at that bed site. And we go to all of these individual moose's bed sites many different times to many bed sites, and then we can compare our male moose using some attributes that non-reproductive females don't use, and vice versa. So I showed you a picture of a bed site, or a video of a bed site that was in standing water. Here we can see it's pretty muddy and wet. That's a nice bed site that would pull heat away from a moose. And actually we often see things like this, where it seems like the moose has even cleared vegetation away, maybe to get its body even closer to that wet soil. And now I have an example of a not so great bed site. This moose is sitting in some pretty dry sand. We can see there's not a lot of cover from the shade, and that sand isn't doing as good a job as moist soil would from pulling heat away from the moose's body. So I talked a lot about females, but now we got to get to the guys. Of course, we're going to be, like I mentioned, comparing what sort of habitat they use in the summer to stay cool. But I also want to zoom in on a really critical time of year for moose, which is autumn. In the autumn is the moose rut. That's when males start putting in a huge amount of effort to find females and mate with them. It's the mating season. And when you think of the rut, you probably think of something like this picture, like 2 huge bulls crashing together, and whoever's stronger wins and gets access to the female and gets to mate with more females. And that's true, that happens during the rut, but there's actually a lot more to it than just brute force. And this is because females, and moose in general, are very solitary. So females are spread out on their own all across the landscape, and males have to spend a ton of energy just to find the female. So they kind of go wild searching all over to find a female. Once they find her, then it's time to defend her from rival males. And I'm going to show you an animation of what that moose movement looks like. So this is a map of our study area, and each different colored line is an individual collared male moose. And we'll start before the rut so you can get accustomed to what normal summer movement looks like, And then you'll see how that changes during the mating season and how their effort and movement begins to change. So we'll start at the end of August and then go through to the beginning of November. So here we have all of our individual moose at the end of summer, moving normally. Things start to speed up. They're going all around, they're looking for females, they're fighting with each other, and we get to mid-October, and things start to slow back down a little bit into November. I can show that again because I think it's pretty cool. So here's that regular summer movement. We get into the beginning of September. Things start to go totally crazy. And then we get to calm down and hopefully rest for the rest of the winter. So during the rut, males have to make these like crazy movements looking for females, and they also, when they find them, have to defend those females against rival males. It's a lot to worry about. It's a stressful time of life. They're so busy that they actually completely stop eating during the rut. It's called hypophagia. So they don't eat at all. They're just focusing on mating efforts. And if you think about all of the energy it takes for a female to go through gestation and lactation. So to grow an entire calf inside her and then give birth to that calf and feed that calf the whole summer. If you add up all of that energy and then condense it into 3 weeks, that's what's happening with bulls during the rut. They spend the same amount of energy that females spend on reproduction for all of those months just during this rutting period. So it's super intense, really costly, and that's one of the reasons why we want to better understand what's happening. And a huge part of what I want to look at is how do individual traits impact a moose's approach to the rut? So they have to balance this searching behavior with this defending behavior, but also moose differ. There are some trophy bulls, huge, strong, prime-aged, and then there are bulls that are smaller, either because they didn't have what it takes to get there or because they're just younger. And we would expect that these bulls would have different approaches. So, for example, a really strong, large bull with great antlers, when he finds a female, he knows he can ward off any rival. He can stay there defending her. But a young bull, like the one on the left, might find females, get kicked off by a bigger male, and have to keep looking. So maybe younger males are spending more time searching, while older males are spending more time defending. And of course, it all has to come back to temperatures getting warmer. Things get more complicated as falls heat up. So I want to call back to what we talked about with how body size impacts heat sensitivity, and that we would expect larger animals to be more sensitive to the heat, which means that the bulls that we expect to win out during the rut, these big males, might actually suffer more on a hot day than a smaller male. So our question is, are warmer falls actually tipping the scales and favoring younger, smaller bulls to succeed during the rut? And the consequences of this happening are that different genetics get passed on in the population. So we talked about how warmer summers might be impacting calf survival, which could impact population growth, but warmer falls could be impacting whether or not the best genetics get passed along into the population. So that's a potential impact at 2 different scales that could hurt moose populations. Now, before I wrap up, I do want to show you all a couple more videos because I always get questions about what moose are eating. So we're going to walk through the year and show you a couple videos of what moose are eating throughout the year. This is winter. Tell me if you would like to eat this. Pretty tasty. This is a willow shrub, even though it's hard to recognize without any leaves on it. That's a huge part of the winter diet of moose, just eating twigs. And we also see them eating a lot of spruce and fir, which is probably more nutritious than just the twigs themselves. But luckily, winter ends, spring comes, and moose keep eating willows, but this time they look a little bit tastier. Willows of many different species are the predominant part of moose diet. So pretty much anywhere moose are in the world, they're probably eating willows. They may be eating a different species or different amounts, but it is sort of a pretty necessary part of their diet. That doesn't mean that they don't eat other stuff, like this horribly pokey ribes bush that I would not want to eat. If you all have spent time out in early summer, late spring, I'm sure you've noticed that these currant bushes, ribes, are some of the first things to get green. So while everything else is brown, you'll see those ribes leaves start to pop up and get green, and that's when we notice moose eating them the most, is when there aren't a lot of other options, which I understand. And lastly, some plant ID test for you all. If anyone recognizes this flower, I'll be impressed. Oh, you all got it. So this is fireweed. It's a really, really beautiful flower, one of my favorites, and I couldn't believe it when this first popped up on the video. I don't really think of moose eating flowers, but we have a ton of video of them chowing down on fireweed, so that's pretty exciting to see. Great, I just wanted to show those food videos to illustrate, like, I got to talk about a small portion of the work that I'm doing, but there's a whole other world of questions and information that we're getting to better understand moose populations. So happy to answer all sorts of questions about that, and just wanted to tease that there's so much more than what I got to share today. But to summarize, we talked about how warmer temperatures are driving declines in moose populations across their southern extent. And in my work, I'm trying to understand the mechanisms behind those declines and how individual traits might be helping or hindering moose in facing these warmer temperatures. And this information will help inform the management of both males and females, so that as we intervene to help moose populations, we're making sure that our intervention efforts are helping all the individuals in a population and not biased towards one group or another. Before I stop for questions, I have so many people to thank. Bart, Corey, and Nick with Game and Fish. This really would not be possible without their help. I can't imagine the amount of paperwork that Corey has had to do to make this happen, so thank you to him, he's here today, and Bart and Nick for helping on the ground, helping me understand the study area, introduce me to landowners, help me when I'm confused, all that stuff. Andy Pills with the Forest Service has been wonderful. We have so many great funders, Mary and Charlie, Mark Newhouse, Ann and Jim. I want to say a special thank you to Mary. This work would not be happening without her, and I think she's also my motivation when I get tired. It's like Mary loves these moose so much, and so does everyone else, and it just is a wonderful reminder to know why my work matters to so many people. Also, I had so much help in the field from many wonderful technicians and local support. The Pitchfork Ranch was really generous in offering field housing while I collected all of this data. I like to joke that my main finding from this work is that moose love private land. So thank you so much to all the Meeteetse landowners and land managers who have supported this project by letting me go wander around in the woods behind their house. And of course, there's so many folks at the University of Wyoming who have made this possible with all that institutional support. Shout out to Kevin Monteith, Dr. Deere, he's in the audience today. And also I hear there's a big watch party on Zoom in Meeteetse, so hi everyone, thank you so much for tuning in on Zoom. And yeah, just been so wonderful to get to spend my last 2 summers in Meeteetse in a community that cares so much about the work that I'm doing. With that, I will take any questions you all have. Oh yeah, hello. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah.
We make drives to the Bighorn Mountains often, and we go into all the drainages in the park. We see far more moose in the Bighorns than we do over here. Is it habitat, predators, or what's the difference?
That's such a great question. So I'm going to repeat all the questions so that people on Zoom can hear them. We had a question about why do we see more moose in the Bighorns than around here? And there's a lot of reasons. So some background, the population in the Bighorns actually didn't naturally expand there. Like, we brought moose to the Bighorns and introduced them there. And something that's common with moose when they're introduced to an area is when they first get there haven't been any moose using that habitat. So all the delicious stuff that they love to eat is really healthy. There's tons of it, and they can really utilize that resource. And then what we see is often when they're introduced, there's this huge spike, like what we're seeing in the bighorns, and then they might start to actually deplete that habitat and start to crash. So that's one thing that might be going on, is that since they're newer to that area, they still have really wonderful habitat to use. Also, yeah, there are no wolves and grizzly bears there, although in our work we're not seeing a lot of predation-related mortality in adults, so I think it's probably more habitat-related. That's a really good question. So the question was, if we're worried about a population of animals and they're in decline, why do we allow hunting? So there's to get technical, there's these terms additive and compensatory mortality. So around here, winters are really harsh, and not all animals survive the winter. And we can think about hunting as sort of a way to harvest the number of animals that otherwise would have died. So there's a way to calculate this many animals might die during the winter, and when we harvest animals, it's sort of taking away from the number that would have died anyway. Not everyone is convinced by that, so I have another angle to look at it from, and that is in moose we focus on male hunting, particularly in populations that aren't doing so well. And we actually don't need as many males on the landscape as we do females. So females are the ones that are reproducing, they're raising that calf, they're putting all that energy in. And if we have equal numbers of males and females, that isn't actually representative of how a really natural system with an intact predator community might work. There's often fewer males, and especially that now that we have fewer predators than moose often have experienced in the past, hunting simulates that lower number of males, which means that there's less stress on the environment for females, and potentially the females can do better. Yeah. Sí, sí hablo español. Alces. So the question was, how do you say moose in Spanish? Se dice alces. Sí, hablo español. Si tienen preguntas en español, les puedo responder. Yeah. Mi mamá es de Chile, así que ella me crió hablando español en casa. Yeah. She asked, how did I learn Spanish? My mom is from Chile. She came here as an adult and met my dad, so I grew up speaking Spanish at home. Yeah. That's such a great question. So the question was, when does the rut happen in this area, and do we see changes in that? So the rut around Meeteetse starts movement starts to ramp up in the middle of September and then tends to die down in the middle of October. And that does vary based on populations, how far north or how far south moose are. We haven't seen too many differences year to year in the population that we're studying in Meeteetse. And one potential reason for that is because there are actually really big consequences for moose calves that are born too late in the summer. So moose have to gestate for a certain amount of time. That's not super flexible. And if the rut shifts later, that means moose calves are born later, and that means that they're smaller and weaker when winter sets in.
One question from a couple questions from online. First being, you mentioned no predation evidence for adult deaths, but what about calf predation evidence that would affect population growth or decline statistics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have seen one predation event in adults, but it was in an animal that was like really sick and dying. So sort of we can see from the camera collar video that this adult had been lying down for many days, which is abnormal. And then a grizzly bear found that animal. So I don't want to misspeak. We have seen one predation, adult mortality from predation. And I think it's a really good point. Calves are much more vulnerable to predation than adults are. But when we check on them in those 2-week windows, we can only detect whether or not the calf survived, not what the cause of the mortality was. We're hoping to be able to pick some of that up on the camera collar videos, but that's hit or miss. So the questions that we are able to answer aren't necessarily how many moose are being killed by bears or wolves, but we can answer what makes a mother moose better at protecting her young.
One more from online here. Where is the most challenging and or odd calving site that you or your team have witnessed?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. So the first calf that was born this year was born on May 10th, and she was born up on a slope above Kerwin, but the road was not navigable, so I had to hike from the Double D Ranch all the way in and check on her. That was a long day, but I was all along a road, so it wasn't too bad. I think the most fun and challenging one was if you're familiar with the Jack Creek area, if you're walking up the drainage, on the left side of the drainage there are these huge cliffs, and we had one give birth at the base of one of those cliffs, and there was one of my first calf searches, so I really didn't want to disturb the pair, and so instead what we did is we hiked up Willow Creek and over Phelps Mountain, and then looked down from like 300 feet above and got to watch this pair like totally undisturbed nursing. So that was a time when the effort paid off, because I think it's one of my favorite things to get to watch them totally undisturbed and just see like how they are when no one's watching. Yeah.
What time period do all moose shed their antlers? Does that vary in part of the country that you may be?
That's a great question. I'm so excited to tell you about this. So to my knowledge, it doesn't vary. Well, it varies based on when the rut is. So if the rut is earlier, the shedding of the antlers will be earlier. So it varies based on the size of the bull and the size of his antlers. So really large bulls tend to shed their antlers soon after the rut, and younger bulls will hold onto their antlers longer. And there's some people who think the reason large bulls shed their antlers so soon after the rut is because those antlers would be a cue to predators after the rut. Hey, look, this guy spent all of his energy and he's not going to be able to fight you off. Like, come get him. And if they shed their antlers, then they can blend in with the females more, so they're not as much of a target. And they're heavy, yeah. Why would you want to lug that around? Exactly. Yeah. That's a great question. There's not a difference between the number that are born. There's some work in mule deer that shows that males are more costly to raise, but that's not totally established in moose. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't repeat that question. I totally lost track of repeating the question. Sorry to everyone on Zoom, but hopefully it's still been interesting.
What's the total count of moose in the greater Yellowstone area?
So the question was, what's the total count of moose in the greater Yellowstone? I don't know how many there are in the greater Yellowstone. I can tell you that in our study area, we have 30 collared, and Bart, the biologist, estimates that in that area with the map I showed you, there's about 100. I use the internet for this kind of picture. That's a great question. So the question was, are moose moving higher up in elevation as temperatures increase? So throughout the summer, that's something that we notice, that they'll slowly move higher up in elevation. And it's hard actually to untangle whether that's in response to temperatures getting warmer or whether they're following plants as they get green. And it could be both. So that's definitely at play, and sort of in the broader context of how populations are doing, it's great to have them in these areas where they have that flexibility to move up, but also as they move up, the area that is an option gets smaller because that's how mountains are. So it's a really good option for them to be behaviorally flexible, but doesn't necessarily protect them in the long term. Yeah. That's a wonderful question. So the question was, what kind of willow do they favor in this area, and could we be somehow stimulating the growth of that willow? So based on talking to Bart, my focus isn't on their dietary needs, but talking to Bart, the biologist who's been here for a very long time, he says they tend to eat a lot of Booth's willow. And in terms of favoring that, we have some folks at Game and Fish here, so I'll have to ask them after this what sort of habitat treatments they have in mind in the area. But we actually are hoping to start some work looking specifically at willow growth, and not so much at species level stuff, but there's evidence to show that as a willow plant gets older, its leaves get less nutritious, and it may look fine to the naked eye, but it's actually declining because willows sort of benefit from periodic disturbance. So something we want to look into in the future moose studies, is can we sort of disturb a willow community and in the long run make that more productive? Tune in a couple of years.
A question about collars. Sorry, up here. How long do they last, and do you replace them?
Great question. So different collars last a different amount of time. The ones that we have out on bull moose, we put out at the beginning of the study, and they last for 3 years. The ones that we have on females, since they're camera collars, we recatch the females every March to retrieve those collars so that we can get the video off of them, and also so that we can see if the female is pregnant. Yeah. That's a good question. So the question was about chronic wasting disease and if we're finding that more and more in moose. It's actually not something. Moose don't contract chronic wasting disease in the same way that mule deer or white-tailed deer do. They can contract it, and there have been instances where they do, but not at the same rates, and it's not something that's currently threatening moose populations. We're not exactly sure why that is, but one idea is that CWD is passed both between animals and in the environment, and since moose are so solitary and have their own home ranges, they might just not be encountering that many sources of the disease.
Got another one online here. Last one. With the collared moose in higher elevations of the wood and gray bull country, are you seeing them move back and forth at all to wintering on the Dubois East Fork side of the range?
I feel like someone's setting me up to tell a cool story. I don't know if like Kevin's on there online, but so we have one instance of a moose crossing the Absarokas. There's a male that in the summers hangs out by Kerwin up at the top of the Wood River. And before the rut starts every fall, he crosses over the Absarokas into the East Fork of the Wind River, and he spends the rut there, spends the entire winter there. Then he did that for the first time last year. Then this summer, he tried to come back. There was too much snow. He turned around, waited 2 weeks, came back, and spent his whole summer up by Kerwin. And come fall, he's back on the other side of the Absarokas. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great question. So the question was, how are the cameras collecting data? How much are they collecting? How are they programmed? So yeah, they're out for a year, and we have them programmed to start filming when a moose gives birth. So when we catch the moose, we ultrasound them for pregnancy, and if they're pregnant, we fit them with what's called a vaginal implant transmitter. And that tells us when the moose gives birth, and it sends the signal to the camera collar to start recording so that we can capture those first 6 minutes after the birth event. So there's a 6-minute video, and then for the rest of the summer, we have 10-second videos every hour during daylight hours.
How stressful is it for the moose to be caught more than once for collar replacement?
That's a great question. I don't have to repeat that. That's a Zoom question. So there's a lot of work looking at like capture, because it's a common tool, and especially repeat capture, because from the human eye, it is a stressful event. And I don't want to mislead you. Capturing animals can be dangerous for them. And of course, it causes some acute stress response in that they run away from the helicopter, things like that. But there's actually a lot of evidence to support that capturing, when it's done in the context of the environment and in response to what's around the animal, doesn't have to negatively impact a population long term. So for example, when we catch moose in the Meeteetse area, there's really low snow accumulation. So a common way of catching animals is to shoot a net over them and then hobble them so they're totally awake. But moose are so tall that this would be dangerous for them, and we could break their bones because of that big fall. So instead of doing that, we use a chemical immobilizer, and that way they go down more slowly. And we've had a lot of success with that. Yeah.
So you showed that there were 13 females that were pregnant in March, and then 10 gave birth. So what about the 3? What happened to the 3?
Good question. So 10 had a live calf, which means 3 did not have a live calf when we searched within 24 to 48 hours after the birth event. So one of them had a premature birth, aborted calf in mid-April, and that often happens when a moose doesn't have enough energy to see through that pregnancy to the end of the winter. One had early mortality in the birth site, so I arrived to search the birth site within 4 hours of the birth event, and the moose calf was dead, and we took it to the lab, and it had taken at least a breath, but maybe not strong enough. It looked like there was some sort of infection in the materials in the lungs. And then the last one gave birth on private property that we didn't have access to. So when we were able to go search that moose, she didn't have a calf with her.